Thank you everyone for accessing this pre-recorded virtual presentation. I'm really happy to participate at this 13th International Conference on the Inclusive Museum. I am a PhD researcher at King's College London in the Department of Culture, Media and Creative Industries, and I feel really glad to have been given this opportunity to share with you, and for the first time, some findings of a study that I previously conducted. The paper I'm presenting today is based on an empirical research that I completed in 2017 as part of my MA in Museum and Gallery Practices at University College London Offshore Department in Doha, Qatar. I've been recently started revising this study with the idea of expanding the research due to the worldwide events of this year. Therefore, I'll be very interested in hearing your comments, feedbacks, or any suggestion you might have for my research. So you are welcome to contact me at the email address here provided. The title of this presentation is The Economics of Admission, an Empirical Research on the Fitzwilliam Museums, Cambridge, and the Museum of Islamic Art, Doha. The topic focuses on free admissions museum policies and the impact of those on audience attendance and diversification. Nowadays, there is an increasingly contested debate around the philosophy and affordability of the museum policy of free admissions. Entrance fees have been often defined by scholars as one of the most significant hindrances preventing a greater audience from accessing a museum or thinking about potential visits. This is because a museum should, at least theoretically, never deny the chance to be educated and taught to anyone because of an inability to pay. Nevertheless, due to the economic crisis, recent budget cuts by governments, and the financial challenges that the cultural sector in general, and museums in particular, are now facing, many other professionals argue that a charging policy can be now a reasonable approach to sustain museums. This creates a great controversy and ethical dilemmas that are still far from being solved. The motivation driving this study is a research interest in understanding the relation between a museum attendance and entrance fees, and to investigate to what extent an admission ticket would prevent lower economic groups to visit museums. To date, there's also a scarcity of empirical research on the subject and a lack of studies specifically focused on cases in the Middle East, as the research does. I decided therefore to investigate this topic by conducting an empirical research trying to reply to the question: are entrance fees a real barrier for diversifying museum audiences? The main hypothesis that I wanted to test was museum fees do not necessarily represent a strong barrier to audience diversity. To do so, I selected two case studies in order to gather data from different backgrounds and test their hypotheses in different contexts and with diverse participant groups. This allowed to have more reliable results and add validity to the study. The selected museums were the Fitzwilliam in Cambridge, in UK, and the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, Qatar. The first case study selected is the Fitzwilliam Museum, which has recently celebrated its 20th anniversary. The museum was founded in 1816 thanks to the bequest of the 7th Viscount of Marion, Richard Fitzwilliam, who donated his entire collection of artworks, including masterpieces by Titian, Veronese and Palma Vecchio, and his library, to the University of Cambridge. After being hosted in a couple of temporary accommodations, the founder's collection found its permanent house in an elegant neoclassical building designed on purpose by the architect George Basevi near the city centre. In 1848, the Fitzwilliam Museum opened to members of the university and to the public. Today, the Fitzwilliam Museum houses a world-renowned collection of over 500,000 beautiful works of art, masterpieces, paintings, and historical artifacts. It is a vast collection of objects ranging from ancient Egyptian, Greek, and Roman antiquities to the arts of the present day. It has been defined as one of the finest collections of paintings, drawings, and prints in Britain, and significant collection of Asian art, medieval illuminated manuscript, and an outstanding collection of applied arts, pottery, porcelain, and medieval coins. The Fitzwilliam Museum is also nowadays a UK leader in fine art conservation, and the institution is the principal museum of the University of Cambridge, leading the University of Cambridge Museums Consortium, an Arts Council England funded national portfolio organization. The museum is now free to visit. The second case study I use for this research is the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, Qatar. Opened to the public the 1st December 2008, the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, mostly known as MIA, is dedicated to reflecting the full vitality, complexity, and diversity of the arts of the Islamic world. Pieces in the collection are all connected by Islam, but many are not religious in nature. The collection has now a significant historical and artistic value. The building was commissioned to the Pritzker Prize-winning architect Yeon Min Pei, who found his inspiration in the Mosque of Ibn Tulun in Cairo, that he defined to be the very essence of Islamic architecture. The museum is made of limestones and it's built on an island off an artificial projecting peninsula on the Corniche, the city's waterfront promenade, and surrounded by a purpose-built park. The institution has rapidly become an iconic feature of the Doha landscape. MIA hosts a collection of Islamic art from 3 continents and covers a period of time comprised from the 7th to the 19th century. Objects include metalwork, ceramics, jewelry, woodwork, textiles. It has been described as one of the world's most complete collections of Islamic artifacts, with items originating in Spain, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, India, and Central Asia. At the time of the study, also this museum was free to visit. In 2017, when this study was conducted, both museums were an example of free admission policy according to the national museum practices of the UK and Qatar. They are both considered key cultural institutions in their cities, hosting a vast and rich collection of artworks and the most visited museums in their respective cities. The Fitzwilliam Museums offer still today free access to its visitors, as specified on the main page of its website, whilst since 2019, Qatar Museums Authority decided to start charging the admissions to its museums. A fee of 50 Qatari Riyal, equivalent to around £10 or $13, has since then been applied, but only to visitors coming from outside the country. National residents of Qatar continue to have therefore free access to the museum still today. The study's methodology employed an online survey composed by 10 questions. 2 slightly different survey forms were created to adapt to each local context. The survey collected information on the demographics, socioeconomic and educational backgrounds of the research participants. Particular attention was then given to the participants' willingness to pay to visit a museum and their motivations to do so. The research participants groups included residents of Cambridge and Doha. The responses collected were 51 per each survey for a total of 102 research participants. The data were examined using descriptive statistical analysis, and a sub-analysis was also performed using the questions related to education and monthly income as classifiers to better understand the connection between the participants' educational and economic background and their willingness to pay to visit their local museum, meaning one of the selected case study, as well as for a well-known institution. The results of the surveys showed similarity among the demographics and socioeconomic backgrounds of the research participants. In both cases, in fact, the majority of surveys fell in an age range between 31 and 40 years old. In specific, 45% of participants in Cambridge and 26% of respondents in Doha were in that category. This group was followed by a percentage of 25% in Cambridge and 21% in Doha of people between 23 and 25 years old. The greatest similarity among the two participant groups was instead found in the level of schooling. In both cities, a high level of education of participants was discovered. A total of 70% of respondents in Cambridge and a total of 65% of respondents in Doha had obtained a master's degree or a PhD. As shown later, this represents an important datum that connects education level with the willingness to pay for visiting a museum. Regarding the occupation, the majority of respondents in both cities were either students or private sector employees. Whilst when it comes to the monthly income, there are substantial differences among the two research participant groups. Most of the participants in Cambridge selected a monthly income between 1,500 and 2,000 pounds, British pounds, which fell in a low-medium income level. Meanwhile, in Doha, the majority of people had a salary average comprised between 20,000 and 30,000 Qatari Riyal, equivalent to 3,000 and 5,000 British pounds, showing a higher economic status of this second group. Coming to the main focus of the research, at the question, suppose the relative museum charged an entry fee, what would you be willing to pay? A very clear situation was shown in participants' responses. In both surveys, a significant vast majority of respondents indicated that they would be willing to pay an entrance fees to visit either the Fitzwilliam Museum or the Museum of Islamic Art. In fact, the total percentage of people willing to pay a fee comprised between £3 up to over 15 British pounds was 82% in Cambridge and 88% in Doha. This contrasts with a small minority of 18% of people in Cambridge that were not inclined to pay any fee to visit their local museum. And even smaller is the percentage of respondents not willing to pay any fee for visiting MIA that reaches only 12% of research participants. This trend becomes even more blatant and clear when it comes to the participants' willingness to pay for visiting a well-known museums. To this question, a total of 92% of surveys in Cambridge and a total of 94% of respondents in Doha replied that they would be willing to pay for visiting a well-known museum. There was even a remarkable percentage of 10% of respondents in Cambridge and 80% of respondents in Doha that selected the most expensive choice proposed for a fee, which was respectively over £15 for the UK and 50 Qatari Riyal for Qatar. This sum was based on the cost of the ticket for the Louvre in Paris. These results show another very interesting datum, which is the fact that people are generally more inclined to pay for a famous museum in comparison to how much they are willing to pay for their local museum. This clearly reflects the fact that if the public believes that a museum is worthy and prestigious, they would be glad to pay even a considerable amount for an admission fee. These findings are also reinforced by the respondents' replies to the last question about their motivations to pay a ticket for visiting a museum. As shown in the graph, the collection and a specific exhibition were overall the main reasons selected by participants for paying a museum admission ticket. This data suggests that when visitors believe that the museum and/or its collection is interesting and worthy of being seen and visited, The presence or not of an admission ticket does not influence much their decision and does not prevent them to visit a museum. It is in fact fundamental, as suggested by the scholar Thompson, to raise the question about how much individuals value the arts, especially in a period in which the museum sector and more broadly the cultural sector are being heavily affected by funding cuts, such as nowadays. An entrance fee could paradoxically inspire the awareness of the importance and value of a museum among museum goers as well as new potential audiences. This assumption might actually even result in an increase in the figures of visitors. It should be noted that free and low quality are often concepts linked together in people's mind, as suggested by the scholars Diggol or more recently by Lin. This is a well established thought that frequently leads to an underestimation of art, museums, as well as of museum workers and professionals of the sector in general, when instead it should be given the emphasis on quality and value for money. More importantly, as shown in this research, admission fees do have a little impact on audience diversity. Tony Butler, executive director at Derby Museum, clearly explained this concept in an interview, reporting this. In 20 years, the UK policy of free admission to national museums has had the effect of dramatically increasing the number of visits. Likewise, investment in learning and activity programs in regional museums since 2000 have seen a tendency surge. Visits from those on low incomes have risen, though not as much as those from those on higher incomes. More people are visiting museums than ever before, but it appears that it is middle class people going again and again. To date, there is also no clear evidence whether, thanks to a free admission, the number of visitors has increased or it's just the same people going more often to museums. Pulling together all the results, it seems clear that the strongest factor influencing people's decision to visit a museum is the willingness to do so, rather than any kind of economic evaluation. This willingness to pay is instead more strongly connected to the educational background of the visitors. The data collected suggest, in fact, that people with a high level of education, which does not necessarily correspond to high economic status, are more inclined to pay for a museum ticket. Museum admission fees do not seem to be a hindrance for visitors that are particularly willing to visit an institution. Thus, an entry fee adequate to the expected target and the value of the museum and the collection might be proposed as a feasible means of increasing resources without jeopardizing the number of visits. Although this analysis is of course limited to the two selected case studies, the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge and the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, the different context and features of the examined institutions, contrasted by the similarities in the responses collected, could lead, in a broader scale, to the assumption that a museum charging policy does not represent a major barrier in diversifying museum audiences, and this consideration could be generally applicable to other museums and cultural institutions, at least in similar settings. To conclude, building on this idea, people might be incentivized to consider museums more valuable and important if they present an admission charge. In addition to that, the increased financial resources and cash flow accumulated by charging admission can not only increase museums' future sustainability, but also promote many other museums' activities, such as the acquisition of new artworks, the improvement of the facilities, the implementation of collaborations, the development of new programs, and so on, which are activities that might be more effective in promoting audience diversity, bringing in new social groups. Last but not least, the generated incomes will also help to maintain the salaries of those working hard in the sector. These studies are now relevant more than ever, as a pricing policy could help museums to face the challenges and financial crisis brought by the COVID-19 pandemic. Here you can find the bibliography and list of resources which I use in this presentation. Thank you for the attention.